Alright, welcome back to Wrestling Retold and Relived with Richie Mars, and I, of course, am your gracious host, Richie Mars, and happy Tuesday, everyone. Happy October 17th. Hope today is a great day for each and every one of you. Gives you bliss, and I hope you have a fantastic day today. Again, I always appreciate you tuning in and listening in, and if you want to follow more things that are happening to the podcast and other things that I'm doing currently, at Retold Richie Mars on Instagram, the Twitter, or X, and TikTok. We are closing in on 700 followers on TikTok, so if you want to be one of them, make sure to follow me there. But we're not talking about that. We are talking about today's topic, and it is the curious case of Keith Lee. Now, some of you may know, some of you might not know, Keith Lee was one of the fastest rising stars in WWE for a period of time. Unfortunately, things kind of went down south due to no fault of his own, and we're here to talk about his rise and his leaving to WWE to AEW. Our story begins in 2018. Keith Lee has finally signed with World Wrestling Entertainment after years upon years on the independent scene, through Evolve, through Ring of Honor, everywhere. He's had 3 failed tryouts at WWE at this point, but he began to build a name for himself while he was on the independents, most specifically Evolve, who had a partnership with WWE at that point. And the most important thing I think that stood out to WWE were his matches with Dominik Dijakovic, now known as Dijak in NXT. The reason I say that is both these men are enormous in different ways. Dijak is 6'7", Keith Lee, I believe, at the time was 330 pounds, 6'1", 6'3", and just looked like he could kill you. But they were doing all these cruiserweight-like maneuvers. Keith Lee would do helos over the top rope. He would do moonsaults off the top rope. Dijak would do the spiral tap that AJ Styles would do. And it's a 6'4" man who's doing this, 6'7" man, who's doing this. And with Keith Lee, he's no small guy either, but he kept using all these athletic maneuvers that a guy his size shouldn't be able to do. Like, I believe he would do like a spin kick, he would do roll throughs, he would do backflips on his feet. The man was an anomaly. So obviously, sooner or later, WWE was going to take notice. And notice they did, because WWE was developing NXT, which was their developmental brand, which later turned into a super independent. Basically a Ring of Honor with a WWE budget, which sounds like an awesome time if you are a professional wrestling fan. Now, when Keith Lee first debuted, it was kind of ho-hum. There weren't any vignettes that were playing. They were just, here's Keith Lee. He's in the crowd. They would do these crowd shots at TakeOver. Oh, look, here's the newest signee to NXT. And this time it was Keith Lee. I believe it was Chicago 2, NXT TakeOver Chicago 2. That's when they debuted him in the crowd. And then after that, he would have sporadic matches here and there. I think the first one I remember taking notice of, he was feuding with Cassius Ohno, what some people might know as Chris Hero. So Cassius Ohno and him were feuding. I believe Cassius knocked him out with an elbow a couple weeks before, and Cassius was saying, I'm leaving NXT. And then he went to turn around, and then Keith Lee threw an elbow of his own, and this is what won me over with Keith Lee. Not just the elbow, but the promo after the fact. Because his promo was super entertaining, super different, and it separated him from all the other people his size, or people in NXT. So pretty much he knocks Cassius Ohno out, and Cassius is knocked out, but he's still holding the microphone rigor mortis style. Keith Lee grabs the mic, the crowd chants, "Oh, bask in his glory," which was his catchphrase, and he says, "Oh no." Or should I say, "Oh my God." He said, "It could have been a lot worse for you. You could have hit me in the dangly bits like you did me last week. But let me just tell you, Mr. Ono, don't let your ass hit the door on the way out. Everyone cheers. And there was a scheduled tag team match that was going on. Cassius Ohno interrupted a tag match. And the two people a part of the tag team, I believe it was Humberto Carrillo and somebody else. And Keith Lee grabs a mic and he says, "Gentlemen, pardon the interruption. Audience, pardon the interruption. Let's start this match and get the ball rolling." And then the Street Profits music hits, and then they all celebrate and dance over Cassius Ohno's rigor mortis body. And that simple thing, that simple promo, that's what separated Keith Lee from everybody else in NXT. Showed he was a likable guy, can make fun of himself, and also be a pretty terrifying badass all at the same time. So after that, Keith Lee would be appearing on NXT more sporadically, more week by week, and he had a lot of different matches with Donovan Dijakovic. And there was one spot in this particular NXT match which was very impressive for a guy Keith's size. So the 6'7" or 6'5" Donovan Dijakovic is attempting a monkey flip. Now, a monkey flip, your back's in the corner, and then the guy tries to flip you, so you do pretty much like a somersault onto your back into the middle of the ring. Well, Keith Lee, 330 pounds, does a front flip, lands on his feet, and the entire arena just starts clapping. Because, again, that's all you need. It's not about the moves. It's all about the moments. What moment can you use to have the people in the audience come home to? And that was one of those moments where you've never seen it before. Most likely we'll never see that kind of athleticism for a guy that size ever again. And that's what continued to separate Keith Lee from the pack. I think he was on and off with injuries between 2018, 2019, but when we get to 2019, when he comes back, and he comes back in a big way, not only as a part of the NXT Survivor Series team, but he also participates in NXT's War Games' takeover as a part of the good guy team with Ciampa, Dijakovic, Kevin Owens, and himself against the Undisputed Era led by Adam Cole. And this was the start of the Rocket being strapped to Keith Lee. This is where it felt like the handcuffs were officially off. We're officially going to see Keith Lee as he is meant to be. He has an impressive showing at War Games, and then the next night he goes to Survivor Series, and it's Team Raw versus Team SmackDown versus Team NXT. And if you listen to last week's episode, there's a whole reason why NXT was a part of the Survivor Series. But he was a part of Team NXT. But he wasn't the captain of Team NXT. Ciampa was the captain, and the captains for each brand were Rollins for Raw, Reigns for SmackDown, and Ciampa for NXT. Keith was just a member of the NXT roster. Or the NXT team, rather. So the match continues, and it's a weird 5-on-5-on-5 team with traditional Survivor Series elimination rules. So if you get pinned or submitted, you're out of the match and you have to go to the back. The final three members in this match are Seth Rollins, Roman Reigns, and Keith Lee. So immediately, you could tell WWE is seeing something in Keith Lee to be a part with two of the top stars at that time in WWE. And he even gets the pinfall victory over Seth Rollins, which would later turn into be the catalyst for the Seth Rollins Messiah character. But finally, it is Keith Lee versus Roman Reigns. Winner wins for their team at Survivor Series. Big stakes here. So they face off. Roman immediately goes for 2 Superman punches. Ref counts 1, 2. Kind of hit the mat for a 3, but Keith Lee kicked out, so the final 3 count was waved off. But then Keith Lee catches Roman Reigns with a Spirit Bomb, Power Bomb for the 1, 2 kick out. But Keith Lee, he hesitates no longer. He drags Roman Reigns' body to the corner. Keith Lee goes to the second rope. He yells, he's going for a moonsault, and a moonsault for a man that size is very impressive. Roman Reigns ducks, misses out of the way, and then Keith Lee stands up. Roman Reigns hits the spear. 1, 2, 3. Roman Reigns' team wins. Keith Lee was the final man eliminated. But after the match, that's where the story was even told more. Because Roman Reigns gives a fist bump of acknowledgement to Keith Lee. So he earned the big dog at that time's respect. And that is what separated Keith Lee yet again. He got the respect of the top star of that company. So now, in this period of time, you could see NXT using Keith Lee more and more and more to build off of this momentum. And to keep the momentum going, there was an NXT taping, or NXT match, where it was the Undisputed Era defending their tag titles against Dominik Dijakovic and Keith Lee. And there's a GIF to this day is where Keith Lee pounces Adam Cole, and Adam Cole goes flying into the crowd. That became a hot topic GIF for a while. And then another GIF. I'm not sure if it was from the same match, but it's just that iconic as a GIF. Because Finn Balor, he interferes, he's about to take somebody out, and then all you see is Keith Lee rising like he's the Loch Ness Monster, just staring a hole through Finn Balor, and then immediately chokes him in the corner. And again, it's so crazy how the internet and just GIFs and memes in general can do so much for a career nowadays. I mean, look at Hook. Hook started off as a meme for a good while, and he's having a very successful career in AEW. I mean, the John Cena "You Can't See Me" meme is still being used to this day. And honestly, this is just my take. I think it did help John Cena in Hollywood as well, because it gave him a sense of notoriety rather than being that wrestler guy. So Keith Lee having that extra branding would only help Keith Lee, further in this company. And it would continue to go further, and he won the NXT North American title off of Roderick Strong. I believe the first person to take a championship away from the Undisputed Era once they won all 4 belts. And this was a good sign of things to come with Keith Lee. If he could handle having their Workhorse Championship, who knows what the future may hold for him in the future. But we're going to fast forward to the Royal Rumble in 2020. Brock Lesnar is having a heck of a Royal Rumble. He eliminates 12 people in a row, and then number 13 hits. And then you hear, "All bask in his glory," the theme of Keith Lee. And he's strutting to the ring in that giant football stadium field. Camera cuts to Brock Lesnar, and you could hear him say, "Big boy." And the commentary was hyping up Keith Lee huge, saying he's a 5-tool player, he has everything you want in Superstar, and they're not wrong. Keith Lee had a certain charisma about him. He had a certain ring style about him. He had a certain look to him that was different from everybody else and kept him separate from everybody else. He was also the first one in that match to knock Brock Lesnar down single-handedly. So first it was Roman Reigns. Now it's Brock Lesnar. Keith Lee is rubbing elbows with 2 of the top stars in the company, which shows the fate that they had in this guy during that time. And again, none of these moments were really that long. I think if you were combine the final stretch between Keith Lee and Roman Reigns and this Brock Lesnar face-off, I think it would just clock over 5 minutes. And that just goes to show, in wrestling, you don't need 20-minute classics. You don't need 20, 30-minute classics. All you need are those little moments that people won't forget and that are memorable to the audience at large. And that's what makes you a star. Back at NXT, Keith Lee is defending his North American title against many a name. Roderick Strong again, Johnny Gargano, Damian Priest, Finn Balor, Dominik Dijakovic, all in classic encounters. And that is what a title like the North American title, the US title, the Intercontinental title, the TNT title, what have you, are meant to do. It's to not only bring prestige to the title, but bring the person who's holding that championship up to another level where the audience can say, okay, he's doing phenomenally with this championship. I can't wait to see him go for the big title, whether it's a world title, WWE title, NXT title, what have you. But unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic happens, and everything is grounded to a halt for the meantime. Now, WWE and NXT try to make the best out of a bad situation, holding shows at the Performance Center, but it was not the same. Lack of crowd, lack of noise, just not the same kind of oomph. And that also kind of resets your barometer because you're not sure how the crowd is reacting to certain superstars. Is it good or bad? You don't know because the crowd doesn't tell you. All you could go based on is what people are saying online. And even then, that's still a subgroup of people. So with Keith Lee, combined with the fact that AEW is super hot right now at this period of time, so a lot of people weren't as in tune to NXT as they were with AEW because, it's the new toy effect. Oh, something shiny. Let's go over here and play with it. And we'll leave our old toys over here and we'll get back to it when we feel like playing with them again. So the rise of Keith Lee largely kind of went unnoticed until a challenge is made between the NXT and the NXT North American champions, Adam Cole defending his championship against Keith Lee at NXT's Great American Bash. Only if Keith Lee can successfully defend his championship against Johnny Gargano and Finn Balor. Say no more, Keith Lee retains, and then it is off to the Great American Bash. Now, the funny thing about this match, somebody leaked the result of this match a couple weeks before it was set to air. Because, again, during the COVID pandemic, NXT was forced to tape their shows, and I think they taped their shows beforehand anyway. So someone leaked the result of Keith Lee winning the NXT Championship. He's the first singles dual champion in the brand's history, and that was probably the peak accomplishment-wise for Keith Lee. Finally dominating a brand his way, his cadence, his star power, his charisma, his moveset, all led him to that point, and it was successful. Now he would only hold on to the NXT title for a short while. He also vacated the NXT North American Championship, and he lost his NXT title to Karrion Kross. And the reason why that title reign was so short was because he was getting called up to the big time. He was going to be called up to Monday Night Raw, the flagship show of WWE. I was excited. There was a promo that played on SummerSlam saying Keith Lee is coming to Monday Night Raw. I was hyped. Randy Orton's in the ring. He's in the midst of a feud against Drew McIntyre. I'm pretty sure he attacked him earlier in the show, but I can't recall. And then all of a sudden you hear, "All bask in his glory." And then what followed was the stupidest generic rock song you have ever heard. Now let's rewind a little bit. Keith Lee's theme song, Limitless, I believe is the name, is sung by Keith Lee. And had a nice flow, it fit his character, it helped him relate to the crowd in certain ways. I always find that superstars who sing their own entrance music pretty much has a different kind of charisma than everybody else. I might be alone in that, but that's what I feel. So not only did they change Keith Lee's music, they changed his attire. He used to have trunks. Now he has gym shorts almost. And he's wearing a muscle top to cover his belly. And I'm looking at him, and I'm just like, something's really off. And the other part of my brain's like, of course something's off. They changed his whole look. This wasn't his presentation in NXT or the roster spots that we saw him beforehand. So I think that's when it became clear abundantly that the NXT division and the main roster in general, there was no flow to these call-ups. You would get called up, and then it's what creative wanted. It's what Vince wanted for your character. Doesn't matter what you did in NXT, that's different now. We're going to retcon you from the beginning. So it took a little bit to get used to, you know what I mean? And it just felt really weird. He also shaved his facial hair. I'm not sure if that was a personal choice or what have you, but he's in a completely different attire than we're used to seeing him in. But again, I gotta give WWE credit on this regard. They booked him strong from the beginning. He beat Randy Orton at Payback, and Randy Orton was the number one contender at that time. So you beat Randy Orton and a well-established name in the company, clean, you're doing all right for yourself. But it's hard to gauge if Keith Lee was connecting with the crowd or not because there was no crowd. They were in the Thunderdome. So I think the crowd was a double-edged sword here. It's not good because you can't hear the reception that Keith Lee is getting, but it's also good because if there was a crowd where he would show up in the attire he was given in, I don't think the crowd would be that forgiving on him. And I don't understand what was wrong with his attire in the first place. Was it because he looked too big? That he looked out of shape? Keith Lee used to have abs on his stomach too, you know what I mean? So it's just kind of like, the draw of the Keith Lee character, in my opinion, was a guy that size shouldn't move the way he does, but he does it anyway. So what does it matter how he looks cosmetically? It doesn't make him feel any less of a star. And adding more things to cover him up just seems a little bit weird. They later changed it to a singlet, which looked much better. But again, it's a rocky start to start off with. And on the main roster, Keith Lee would be a part of some high-profile angles for that time. He was positioned as Drew McIntyre's friend, along with Sheamus. And Sheamus was still teetering on that line between heel and babyface. So having Keith Lee associated with those two right off the bat gave him instant credibility in a way. And I think the plan for that year's WrestleMania, I think it was WrestleMania 36, was probably going to be Keith Lee defending the United States Championship against Sheamus. It would make sense. However, before the Royal Rumble, Keith Lee has a bout with COVID, and he cannot participate. So he's out of the Rumble. Then he comes back in early February, gets put through a table by Bobby Lashley, and then he's written off TV because something was off with his blood work. And apparently through this blood work, there was a risk to his health. They weren't sure how his heart was doing since COVID. I believe there was a chance they would have to do genetic testing if they couldn't figure anything out what to do with his heart. And there was a long period of time where Keith Lee couldn't say anything, but he would tease on social media. It's like, oh, I want to say something, but they're not allowing me to say it. Like, kind of implying WWE wasn't allowing him to say something. But again, it was just a lot of anticipating. It's like, oh, geez, what's happening here? You know, that's the dangers of the internet with these teases. If you tease something for too long and then if you don't deliver on it, then all that's going to be happening is wild, rampant speculation. And I don't think anybody wins in that scenario. So it was later determined that they were just monitoring Keith Lee's health, which is a good thing. Props to WWE for showing that. And Keith Lee said he wasn't allowed to work out. He could only go for a brisk walk. And he had his girlfriend, now wife, Mia Yim, take care of him. Thankfully, eventually, everything turned out well. He's in better health, and he got to return on Monday Night Raw against Lashley in an open challenge for the WWE Championship, and unfortunately, Bobby Lashley retains, leaving Keith Lee a little directionless. I believe he lost to Karrion Kross, And then he would beat Cross the following week, and he was sort of in this limbo because, again, it's still so new. Like, what can he do in the ring? Was it a health issue? Was he getting his reps back? Because when you're off for that long amount of time in the ring, you need to get back into ring shape. And that's where Vince McMahon came up with the idea of the Bearcat. So Keith Lee worked as Keith Bearcat Lee, or just Bearcat Lee, which people thought was an homage to Bearcat Wright, who was a wrestler way back in the day. This new character was more intense, was more of a powerhouse, would just throw and launch people all across the ring, which is what he should do, that's what Keith Lee should do. But all that cadence was gone. It looked like they were trying to be a little bit too cute with his presentation. It looked very 80s-ish, where everyone needed a character to connect with the audience. I'm sure if Keith Lee continued on with the Bearcat character, I think it would have gone over fine. It just depended on how they presented it. And according to Keith Lee on Talk Is Jericho, when he left, the presentation kind of confused him because they say he needs to be more intense in the ring. And Keith Lee is like, okay, I kind of need a reason to be intense, but I'll try my best. And then they went, oh, cut your promos like this. And he's like, but you told me you don't want me to cut promos like I used to. Because Keith Lee is known for being a very well-astute gentleman, using all these big fancy words. And again, it's one of those things I felt separated him from the pack, a very intelligent guy, just talking very soft-spoken, and does his actions in the ring. I thought it was pretty cool. But a lot of people are critical of that because somebody said this, and now I can't get it out of my mind. They said Keith Lee is like an Elder Scrolls NPC, and now I'm like, oh, God, he does. He does remind me of that. And now it's stuck in my head, and I can't unsee it. So I thank whoever said that for that. And because, he would say in his promos, like, greetings and salutations, Mr. Orton. Just something that's not very wrestling. And Vince McMahon wants something more grimy from Keith Lee. And he said, Keith sounds too smart for his own good. Definitely not the right choice of words for something like that. He could have just said, look, I just want more intensity. This is the character I want to go in this direction. And I think it was, honestly, I see it as a big miscommunication on both parties. Because obviously Vince had this idea on who Keith Lee should be. Keith Lee said, well, the things I was doing before are kind of working. Why don't we just kind of go with that? So again, it was kind of like, let's try to compromise in the middle sort of thing. But unfortunately, on November 4th of 2020, Keith Lee is released from WWE. No, I'm sorry, not 2020, 2021. Jeez, it's been a long day, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, November 4th, 2021. Which is weird because the week before on Ryan Satin's Out of Character podcast, which is the Fox branded podcast for WWE, Keith Lee was on that episode being interviewed. So kind of weird. I don't think his release was planned, or if it was, nobody really said anything about it. And they didn't really give this Bearcat character a chance, or Keith Lee a chance to succeed with the Bearcat, for that matter. There was also a tweet that Keith Lee kind of implied that WWE didn't pay for their medical bills, but then WWE wrote back to, I believe, PW Insider, that if Keith Lee had any problems with their medical bills, they would cover it or something. So I believe there was some controversy there. I haven't heard any updates from that, so I think that was a little bit of much to do about nothing. So then Keith Lee joins AEW All Elite Wrestling, and he is back to his original gear and has reverted back to his NXT gimmick, I guess, being limitless. Shortly thereafter, he forms a tag team with Swerve Strickland. They have a very successful tag team called Swerve in Our Glory. And I like the team very well. The problem is the Acclaimed got very hot after that. So I think the viewpoint of that is, well, let's go with our hot hand. And I believe AEW does that a lot. Is that a blessing or a curse? Who knows? Short term, it's great. Long term, you gotta think about it. So then Swerve turns on Keith Lee, stomps him with a cinder block through the chest. Keith Lee takes a couple months off, has grays in his hair, and he wore a cape for a while with a hood. Again, looks like Elder Scrolls. And then he reverted back to dyeing his hair again. Now, there's been a lot of speculation that Keith Lee isn't in the best shape physically, or still trying to get into his shape physically ever since his bout with COVID. Because that's not something you want to screw around with. I mean, the thing that Keith Lee had was very similar to Bray Wyatt. And unfortunately, Bray Wyatt passed away. So it's something that you have to consistently monitor. So Keith Lee has been having a bunch of these quick matches or tag matches where he doesn't get to do that much. It's still, again, got to build reps in order to get back into ring shape. And only Keith Lee knows what Keith Lee can do. Now, will he be able to attain the glory he once did in NXT? It's tough to say because, again, it's something still so new that we're still trying to figure out on how to process when you have long COVID. So the only person who I believe can answer that question is Keith Lee himself. And it depends on the angles he's in, how invested people can be, and to see what differentiates Keith Lee from NXT to who Keith Lee is in AEW. Is there a difference? Should he switch it up? And look, a lot of people give him flack for switching it up with, with the cape and the beard and the gray hair. But again, he tried something, didn't work, went back to the drawing board. Nothing wrong with that. And another thing that has followed Keith Lee, unfortunately, we talked about social media earlier, was the Walter name change to Gunther. And this caused a lot of controversy in the wrestling community at large. And Keith Lee threw his 2 cents in, and he said, if what I'm hearing is true, then poor Walter. And of course, Gunther became one of the best Intercontinental Champions in history, and he's doing phenomenally in WWE. What I think gets lost in the whole Keith Lee tweet about Gunther/Walter is that WWE trademarked a name. It was Gunther and it was some last name. But apparently it had the same name as a general from a certain group back in World War II. And that's what threw everybody up in arms. At least back to my knowledge, back to my recollection of events. So in hindsight, I understand why Keith Lee tweeted that out. Didn't work out in the long term because they decided to cut the last name from Gunther, and now Walter is now just Gunther. So that's where the story of that tweet kind of comes into play. So it really just kind of depends if Keith Lee is healthy enough to have another successful run. I believe it's always a possibility. Hey, wrestling's wrestling. Things happen all the time that we don't really expect to see. Pretty much on a weekly basis. How many people thought Edge would show up in AEW? A lot of people didn't think that would happen. But with Keith Lee, how I remember him is for a good 8 months, Keith Lee was one of the hottest superstars in WWE at that point. But unfortunately, a lot of things went out of his control, like the COVID pandemic, like the lockdown, like the character change, like the attire change. And I'm not saying if you get stripped of all your character from NXT, you can't have a successful WWE career, because a perfect example of someone who got stripped of their gimmick, their music, their finisher, everything is Hurricane Helms. Because on WCW, he was Sugar Shane Helms, and he had the Vertebreaker as his finisher. He had the the Vertebraker as the theme song. I believe he had a cheerleading section called the Sugar Babies. And when he went to WWE, they changed his name, his music. They took his title away from him. They changed everything about his presentation, and it was up to Hurricane to adapt to that change. So you pretty much have to put in, at least in WWE, you kind of have to adapt with the hand you're dealt with. And Keith Lee started doing that, but unfortunately, again, the COVID got him, and then it was, again, plans can't wait on you forever. So, again, no fault of his own through there. It's just the business kind of has to be pulled in different directions, and it's hard to build momentum when you're on TV, off TV, on TV, off TV. So, it's pretty much up to, well, now Tony Khan, since he's in AEW, to present Keith Lee like a big deal. Now, will that happen? Only time will tell. I believe Keith Lee has the talent, but again, this is a to be continued, and maybe if Keith Lee gets another championship reign, we might have a sequel to this podcast. Little tease for you there. But anyway, that was this episode of Wrestling Retold and Relived with Richie Mars. Again, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Retold Richie Mars. I'll see you guys next week. TTFN, ta-ta for now, and I will see you next time.